Deep in the forgotten hollows of eastern Kentucky, where the mountains rise like ancient guardians and the fog clings to the valleys like secrets too heavy to lift, there existed a family that time itself seemed determined to hide. The year was 1994, when social workers first stumbled upon what would become known as the Harper case, a discovery that would shake the foundations of everything they thought they knew about isolation, survival, and the devastating price of bloodline preservation. The Appalachian Mountains have always harbored stories that polite society prefers to ignore, but nothing could have prepared investigators for what they found that cold November morning when they followed a dirt road that hadn't appeared on any map since 1952. Martha Louise Harper was 17 years old when authorities removed her from the only home she had ever known. A dilapidated structure barely clinging to the side of Clinch Mountain, accessible only by a treacherous path that wound through dense forest for nearly 3 miles. She was the youngest of 9 children born to a family that had lived in complete isolation for over 4 generations. The Harper family tree wasn't a tree at all. It was a twisted circle that folded back onto itself again and again, creating a genetic spiral that defied the most basic laws of human reproduction. Brothers had taken their sisters as partners. Cousins had produced children with cousins so closely related they shared the genetic markers of full siblings. And Martha Louise was the living result of this catastrophic biological experiment. When Dr. Rebecca Thornton, a geneticist from the University of Kentucky, first examined Martha's medical records, her hands trembled. The young woman before her carried genetic abnormalities so severe that her survival into adolescence was, in itself, a medical anomaly. Her facial features bore the unmistakable signs of what scientists delicately termed coefficient of inbreeding. Eyes set too far apart, a pronounced jaw asymmetry, and ears positioned lower than normal development would allow. But it wasn't just Martha's physical appearance that told the story. It was the documentation that social worker Patricia Mills discovered hidden in the Harper homestead. Journals dating back to 1887, written in fading ink by Martha's great-great-grandmother, Esther Harper, that revealed the intentional nature of their isolation. Esther had written with chilling clarity, "We keep our blood pure, we keep our family close. The world outside brings only corruption and weakness." The Harper family had begun their isolation in the late 1880s when patriarch Josiah Harper moved his wife and 3 children deep into the Appalachian wilderness, fleeing what he called the contamination of outsider blood. According to the journals, Josiah believed that family purity was a divine mandate, that keeping bloodlines clean would create a stronger, more spiritually elevated lineage. What it created instead was a genetic nightmare that would echo through 5 generations. Martha's father, James Harper, was the product of a union between his mother and her own brother. James had, in turn, taken his first cousin as a wife, a woman who was also his niece through another family connection. Their children, including Martha, carried genetic loads so heavy that 3 of her siblings hadn't survived past infancy, their tiny bodies unable to sustain life with organs that had formed incorrectly in the womb. The mountain community of Harlan County had whispered about the Harpers for decades, but the family's extreme isolation had kept them beyond the reach of intervention. Local residents spoke in hushed tones about the Harper young'uns, children who rarely appeared in town, who seemed to move with difficulty, whose speech was slurred and incomprehensible to outsiders. When authorities finally intervened in 1994, it wasn't because of concern for the family's well-being. It was because a hiker had gotten lost and stumbled upon the Harper property, witnessing conditions so disturbing that he contacted the state police within hours of his escape from those woods. Officer Daniel McCarthy still remembers that day with a clarity that haunts him. "I've seen poverty," he told reporters years later. "I've seen neglect, but what I saw in that house wasn't just poverty. It was like stepping into a different century, a different world, where the normal rules of human society had been suspended entirely. The house itself was a structure of rotting wood and rusted metal, patched together with materials scavenged from the forest. Inside, 9 people lived in 3 rooms, with no running water, no electricity, and no connection to the outside world beyond occasional trips to town for bare necessities. The smell alone was enough to make hardened law enforcement officials retreat to the yard to compose themselves. But it was the family dynamics that truly disturbed the investigators. The children, ranging in age from 4 to 17, showed clear signs of severe developmental delays. Most couldn't speak in complete sentences. Several displayed physical deformities that made movement painful and difficult. And their eyes held a quality that Patricia Mills would later describe as empty of hope, as if they'd never known there was supposed to be something more to life. Martha Louise was different. Despite her physical challenges, despite the genetic burden she carried, there was something in her gaze that suggested intelligence trapped behind layers of isolation and deprivation. When Patricia approached her that first day, Martha didn't run like her siblings. She stood still, watching with an intensity that was almost unnerving. "Are you here to take us away?" Martha asked, her words slow and carefully formed, as if each syllable required tremendous effort. Patricia nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. Martha's response would stay with Patricia forever. "Took you long enough. Confira se já é inscrito neste canal, porque as histórias que revelamos aqui são as que ninguém mais tem coragem de contar. Os segredos que mudam tudo o que você pensava saber sobre a humanidade." The removal of the Harper children from Clinch Mountain marked the beginning of an investigation that would span 3 decades and uncover one of the most extensive cases of multi-generational family isolation in American history. Dr. Thornton's genetic analysis revealed that Martha Louise Harper had a coefficient of inbreeding of 0.38, a number that should have been impossible for a living human being. To put this in perspective, children born to first cousins typically have a coefficient of 0.0625. Children born to siblings have a coefficient of 0.25. Martha's number indicated that her parents were more closely related than full siblings, a genetic relationship so tight that it created a cascade of health problems that affected every system in her body. She had been born with a congenital heart defect that somehow her body had compensated for. Her kidneys functioned at barely 40% capacity. Her bone structure showed abnormalities that caused chronic pain with every movement. And her cognitive development, while remarkably intact given her circumstances, showed deficits in areas that would make integration into normal society extraordinarily difficult. But Martha was one of the lucky ones. Her brother, Thomas, age 14 when removed from the home, was blind in one eye and deaf in both ears. Her sister, Sarah, age 9, had severe spinal curvature that had gone untreated her entire life, leaving her in constant agony. The youngest child, 4-year-old David, couldn't walk and had the cognitive function of an infant, despite his age. The state of Kentucky placed the Harper children in specialized care facilities, separating them for the first time in their lives. The trauma of separation compounded the trauma of their upbringing, and several of the children regressed significantly in those early months, losing what little speech and social skills they had developed. Martha was placed in a group home in Lexington, 200 miles from the only world she had ever known. The transition was devastating. She spent her first 3 weeks refusing to eat, huddled in a corner of her assigned room, rocking back and forth in a motion that caregivers recognized as a self-soothing behavior developed in her years of isolation. Dr. Amanda Richardson, a psychologist specializing in trauma, was assigned to Martha's case. Their first session consisted of 45 minutes of silence, with Martha staring at the wall while Amanda simply sat, offering quiet presence without demands or expectations. It took 6 months before Martha spoke more than a few words at a time. When she finally began to share her story, what emerged was a narrative so disturbing that Amanda had to take frequent breaks to compose herself. Martha described a childhood where the concept of individual identity barely existed. In the Harper household, children were not individuals with names and personalities. They were simply the young uns, interchangeable units whose primary purpose was to continue the family line. Privacy was non-existent, personal possessions were forbidden, and the notion that one might have desires or dreams separate from the family's collective existence was not just discouraged, it was incomprehensible. "We didn't know we were different," Martha explained in one session, her words halting but clear. "We thought everyone lived like us, close, together, family only. When Papa told us the outside world was evil, we believed him because we had no reason not to." Papa, James Harper, ruled the household with absolute authority. His word was law, his interpretation of the Bible was gospel, and his belief in the sanctity of bloodline purity was the foundation upon which every decision was made. He selected which siblings would partner with, which determining reproductive pairings with the cold calculation of a livestock breeder. Martha's mother, whose name she knew only as Mama, had given birth to 14 children over the course of 22 years. 9 survived past infancy. Of those 9, 3 would die before reaching adulthood from complications related to their genetic conditions. Mama herself had died when Martha was 12, her body simply giving out after years of malnutrition, repeated pregnancies, and untreated medical conditions. The death of her mother was Martha's first clear memory of questioning the world she lived in. "When Mama died," she told Dr. Richardson, "Papa didn't cry, he didn't pray. He just said she had served her purpose, and now the older girls would take over her duties, like she was nothing more than a tool that had broken." That was when Martha began to understand, in some deep and wordless way, that something was terribly wrong with her family. She started paying attention to the way Papa looked at her older sister, Elizabeth, who was 13 at the time. She noticed how he had begun separating Elizabeth from the other children, giving her special instructions, preparing her for what Martha now understood to be her role as the next breeding female in the Harper line. Martha's rebellion, if it could be called that, was small and secret. She began hiding in the woods during the day, climbing trees where no one would think to look for her, creating a private world where she could imagine something different, something beyond the suffocating closeness of family that felt more like a trap than a bond. It was during one of these secret escapes that she encountered the hiker who would ultimately lead to her family's discovery. She had been 15 years old, perched in an oak tree near the edge of the Harper property, when she saw him stumbling through the underbrush, clearly lost and disoriented. She should have hidden. Papa's rules were absolute, no contact with outsiders, ever, for any reason. But something in Martha made a different choice. She climbed down from her tree and approached him, pointing the way back to the main trail without speaking a word. The hiker had looked at her with an expression Martha couldn't interpret at the time, horror mixed with pity, shock mixed with concern. He had asked if she was okay, if she needed help. Martha had run, terrified of what Papa would do if he found out about her transgression, but the hiker had remembered. He had reported what he'd seen, a teenage girl in the middle of nowhere, dressed in clothes that looked homemade and decades out of style, with physical features that suggested serious medical neglect. His report had triggered the investigation that led to that November day in 1994, when Martha's world changed forever. The Harper case attracted national attention in the months following the children's removal. News outlets descended on Harlan County, seeking interviews with anyone who had known about the family's existence. What emerged was a picture of collective denial and willful ignorance that implicated an entire community in the suffering of 9 children. Local residents had known about the Harpers for generations. They had seen the children on rare occasions when James Earl brought them to town for supplies. They had noticed the obvious signs of genetic disorders, the unusual family dynamics, the disturbing isolation, and they had done nothing. "It wasn't our business," one longtime resident told reporters, speaking on condition of anonymity. "Mountain folk value privacy. You don't interfere in another family's affairs, especially not the Harpers." There were stories about that family going back generations. People knew to keep their distance. But the price of that distance was measured in the broken bodies and stunted lives of children who had never been given a choice about the circumstances of their birth or upbringing. Martha's testimony to investigators revealed that the Harper family's isolation was maintained through a combination of fear, religious indoctrination, and deliberate geographical remoteness. James Earl had taught his children that the outside world was filled with demons and corruption, that anyone who left the family would be struck down by divine punishment, that their only safety lay in remaining together, remaining pure, remaining hidden. The family survived through a combination of subsistence farming, hunting, and occasional trading of handmade goods in town. They grew vegetables in a small plot cleared from the forest, kept chickens for eggs, and relied on wild game for protein. Medical care was non-existent. When children were born with obvious deformities or health problems, they either survived through sheer chance or they didn't. There was no middle ground, no intervention, no mercy. Martha described watching her younger brother die from what was likely a treatable infection when she was 8 years old. "He cried for 3 days, she said, her voice flat with the emotional numbness that comes from trauma too great to fully process. "Papa said if God wanted him to live, he would live. If God wanted him to die, no doctor could save him. So we just waited, and he died." The investigation into James Earl Harper revealed a man who was himself the product of multiple generations of consanguineous relationships. His own cognitive function was impaired, his understanding of the world limited by a life spent entirely within the confines of family doctrine. When questioned by authorities, he showed no remorse, no understanding that he had done anything wrong. "I kept my family pure," he insisted during his police interview. "I followed the old ways, the ways my daddy taught me, and his daddy before him. There's no sin in keeping family close. It's the world that's wrong, not us." James Earl Harper was ultimately deemed incompetent to stand trial due to his severe intellectual disabilities, themselves a result of his genetic heritage. He was placed in a state facility where he would spend the remaining 8 years of his life before dying of heart failure at age 53, his body ravaged by the same genetic burden he had passed on to his children. Meanwhile, Martha and her siblings faced the monumental challenge of adapting to a world they had been taught to fear and avoid. For most of the children, the transition proved impossible. The severe developmental delays, combined with the trauma of separation and the challenge of learning to function in modern society, meant that institutional care would be their reality for life. But Martha was different. Despite everything working against her, despite the genetic lottery she had lost before birth, despite the isolation and deprivation of her formative years, something in Martha Harper refused to give up. She worked with her therapists, struggled through remedial education, learned to navigate social interactions that felt alien and terrifying. Dr. Richardson would later describe Martha as one of the most resilient individuals she had ever encountered. "She had every reason to give up," Dr. Richardson explained in a documentary about the case. Her body was failing her, her mind had been filled with lies and fear, and she was trying to learn in months what most people spend 18 years developing. But she kept trying. Every single day she kept trying. By 1997, 3 years after her removal from Clinch Mountain, Martha had learned to read at a 6th grade level. She could write her own name, perform basic mathematics, and engage in simple conversations about topics beyond her immediate experience. These achievements, modest by typical standards, represented a monumental victory over the circumstances of her birth. It was during this period that Martha began to speak more openly about her experiences, contributing to research studies about the effects of extreme isolation and consanguinity on human development. Her willingness to share her story, painful as it was, helped scientists better understand the profound impact of both genetic and environmental factors on human potential. But Martha harbored a secret that she hadn't shared with anyone, not even Dr. Richardson. Before she was removed from the Harper homestead, before the authorities came, she had hidden something in the woods near her family's property, journals and documents that her great-great-grandmother Esther had written, materials that Martha had discovered as a child and secretly read over the years. These documents contained information that would change everything researchers thought they knew about the Harper family. And Martha was waiting for the right moment to reveal them. If you're watching this story and feeling the weight of Martha's struggle, comment below, "Martha deserved better." Let her story be heard, let it matter, because silence is what allowed this to happen in the first place. The year 2024 marked 30 years since Martha Louise Harper's removal from Clinch Mountain. She was now 47 years old, living in a supervised apartment in Lexington with part-time support from social services. Her health remained fragile. The genetic burden she carried ensured that every day was a struggle against her own body's limitations. But she was alive, and more importantly, she was ready to tell the complete truth about her family's history. Martha contacted Dr. Rebecca Thornton, the geneticist who had first examined her 3 decades earlier, and requested a meeting. Dr. Thornton, now semi-retired but still actively researching genetic disorders, agreed immediately. She had followed Martha's progress over the years with a mixture of professional interest and personal admiration for the young woman's tenacity. When they met at a quiet cafe in downtown Lexington, Martha carried a weathered backpack that she placed carefully on the table between them. "I need to show you something," Martha said, her speech still slow but much clearer than it had been in 1994. "Something I should have shared a long time ago, but I wasn't ready. I needed to understand it myself first." From the backpack, Martha withdrew a collection of journals wrapped in plastic to protect them from moisture and decay. These were the documents she had hidden in the woods 30 years ago, recovered during a secret trip back to the mountain in 2010 with the help of a trusted social worker. Dr. Thornton's hands shook as she opened the first journal. The pages were filled with neat, cramped handwriting, Esther Harper's account of the family's deliberate descent into isolation and consanguinity, written between 1887 and 1923. What the journals revealed was shocking, not because it showed intentional bloodline preservation. Researchers had already surmised that, but because it showed that Esther Harper had understood exactly what she was doing. She hadn't been ignorant of genetics or the dangers of consanguineous reproduction. She had been educated, literate, and well-informed about the biological risks of her choices. Esther wrote about reading scientific papers on heredity and genetics in the 1890s, about understanding Mendel's laws of inheritance, about knowing that the path she was choosing for her family would lead to physical and cognitive decline. And she had chosen it anyway, driven by a fanatical belief that spiritual purity outweighed physical health, that keeping the family bloodline uncontaminated by outsiders was worth any price, even the suffering of her own descendants. "I know what the scientists say," Esther had written in 1902. "I know they warn against close breeding, against family unions. But they measure only the body, not the soul. What good is physical health if the spirit is corrupted by foreign blood? My grandchildren may be weak in body, but they will be strong in faith, pure in purpose, untainted by the world's poison." Dr. Thornton felt sick reading these words. Esther Harper had made an informed choice to condemn multiple generations to suffering, disability, and early death in service of an ideology that valued abstract purity over human well-being. It was a level of calculated cruelty that made the case even more disturbing than researchers had initially believed. But the journals contained more than just Esther's rationale. They contained detailed family trees, documentation of every birth, every union, every death over 4 generations. They contained medical observations about the declining health of successive generations, descriptions of children born with severe deformities who died within days or weeks, accounts of pregnancies that ended in stillbirth or miscarriage as the genetic load became too heavy to sustain. Esther had documented everything with the detached precision of a scientist conducting an experiment, even as the subjects of that experiment were her own children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren. She had watched the Harper bloodline deteriorate over decades and considered it a worthy sacrifice for ideological purity. Martha had spent years reading these journals, trying to understand the woman whose choices had determined the trajectory of her life before she was even born. "I used to hate her," Martha told Dr. Thornton. "I used to think she was evil, that she'd destroyed my life and the lives of everyone in my family. But the more I read, the more I realized she was sick. Not physically sick, mentally sick. She'd convinced herself that she was doing something noble, something important. She never saw us as people. We were just pieces in her experiment." The revelation of these journals prompted a renewed investigation into the Harper case. Genealogical researchers used Esther's documentation to trace the family tree back to its origins, revealing that the Harpers had once been a prosperous farming family in Virginia before Josiah Harper's religious fanaticism drove them into the mountains. The genetic analysis was updated with modern techniques, revealing that the Harper family had accumulated deleterious recessive alleles at rates unprecedented in documented human populations. Every member of the family carried genetic variants associated with numerous serious health conditions. The miracle wasn't that so many Harper children had died young. The miracle was that any had survived at all. Martha's own genome became a subject of intense study with her permission. Scientists found that she carried variants associated with at least 17 different genetic disorders, any one of which could have been fatal if circumstances had been slightly different. Her survival was attributed to a combination of luck, natural selection of the least harmful genetic combinations, and what one researcher called sheer biological stubbornness. But the most significant revelation from the journals was Esther's prediction about the family's future. In her final entry, dated 1923, just before her death at age 71, she had written, "I know this path leads to extinction. I know that in 3 or 4 more generations the Harper line will end, unable to sustain itself, but it will end pure, untainted, faithful. And that is enough. That is everything." Esther had known her ideology would destroy the family. She had known and proceeded anyway, valuing her abstract ideals over the lives of her descendants. It was a level of ideological zealotry that made Martha's survival and recovery all the more remarkable. "She tried to break us," Martha said, her voice strong despite the emotion behind the words. "She tried to turn us into something less than human, just tools for her sick vision. But she failed. I'm still here. I'm still a person. I'm still human, no matter what my genetics say." The The public release of Esther Harper's journals in 2024 reignited national interest in the Harper case and sparked broader conversations about the intersection of ideology, isolation, and human rights in America's rural communities. Martha found herself at the center of media attention once again, but this time she faced it with 30 years of growth, therapy, and self-understanding behind her. She agreed to a series of interviews in which she spoke candidly about her childhood, her struggles with adaptation, and her determination to create a life that honored the siblings and cousins who hadn't survived, who hadn't gotten the chance she had to escape the legacy of Esther Harper's cruelty. "People ask me if I'm angry," Martha told one interviewer. "Of course I'm angry. I'm angry that my brothers and sisters died for nothing. I'm angry that my mother suffered and died believing she was serving some holy purpose. I'm angry that I live every day in a body that hurts because someone 100 years ago decided their ideas were more important than their grandchildren's lives. But anger isn't all I am. I'm also grateful. I'm grateful I survived. I'm grateful I got out. I'm grateful I learned that family doesn't have to be a prison." Martha had maintained contact with two of her surviving siblings, Thomas, now living in a care facility in Louisville, and Sarah, who had died in 2015 from complications related to her spinal condition. The other siblings had either passed away or remained too impaired to maintain relationships beyond their institutional settings. The Harper property on Clinch Mountain had been abandoned since 1994, slowly reclaimed by the forest. In 2024, Martha made one final journey to the place of her birth, accompanied by Dr. Thornton, Dr. Richardson, and a documentary crew capturing the 30th anniversary of her rescue. The house had collapsed in on itself, the rotting wood finally surrendering to time and weather. Trees grew through what had been the main room. Vines covered the rusted metal roof. Nature was erasing the physical evidence of the Harper family's existence, returning the land to wilderness as if the tragedy that had unfolded here had never happened. Martha stood in front of the ruins for a long moment, her eyes scanning the remnants of her childhood. "This place took everything from me," she said quietly. "My health, my childhood, my family. It almost took my life. But it didn't take my humanity. That's the one thing Esther Harper couldn't destroy, no matter how hard she tried." She walked to a spot near where she had hidden the journals 30 years earlier and planted a small oak sapling, a living memorial to the family members who had died in service of someone else's toxic vision. "They deserved better," Martha said, her hands gentle as she patted soil around the young tree's roots. "They all deserved so much better than what they got." The documentary about Martha's story, titled Legacy of Purity, aired in late 2024 and won numerous awards for its unflinching examination of ideological extremism, genetic consequences, and the resilience of the human spirit. Martha donated all proceeds from the documentary to organizations working to identify and assist isolated communities and families at risk of similar situations. Dr. Thornton published a comprehensive study of the Harper case in a leading genetics journal, using it to advocate for better public health outreach in rural communities and improved education about the dangers of consanguineous reproduction. The study became one of the most cited papers in the field, influencing policy and practice regarding genetic counseling in isolated populations. Dr. Richardson wrote a book about trauma recovery using Martha's journey as the central case study, demonstrating that even the most severe developmental and psychological damage can be partially overcome with appropriate support, time, and the individual's own determination to heal. Martha herself became an advocate for children in isolated or high-control family situations, speaking at conferences and training sessions for social workers and law enforcement about the warning signs of extreme isolation and the importance of intervention even when communities resist outside involvement. "The thing about secrets," Martha told audiences, is that they only have power when we keep them. Esther Harper wanted her family's purity to be a secret, something hidden from the world. But secrets are what allowed the suffering to continue for generations. When we shine light on these dark places, when we tell the truth about what happened and why it was wrong, we take away the power of the people who use isolation and ideology to hurt others. Ooh. In 2025, Martha celebrated her 48th birthday, surrounded by friends she had made over 3 decades of life outside the Harper compound. Social workers, therapists, fellow survivors of trauma, and people who valued her for who she was, not what her genetics said she should be. Her health remained fragile. Her body carried the permanent marks of her genetic heritage, but her spirit, against all odds, had proven stronger than the ideology that tried to break it. The oak tree she planted on Clinch Mountain began to grow, its roots pushing deep into soil that had witnessed too much suffering, its branches reaching toward light, a living testament to survival and renewal. If you've watched this story all the way through and felt Martha's pain, her strength, her triumph against impossible odds, do me a favor. Subscribe to this channel so we can continue revealing the stories that history tried to bury, the truths that challenge everything we think we know about family, faith, and human resilience.